a cold and silent night, Miguel encounters a young girl, lost and alone on a dark street corner. Something about her makes him stop, but he has no idea this unexpected meeting will unearth long-buried secrets from his past. Who is this girl? And why does she seem so connected to him? As Miguel gets closer to the truth, he realizes time is running out, and his chance for redemption may be slipping away.
Miguel walked down the dimly lit street, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his worn coat. The evening air was crisp, biting against his withered skin. His breath came out in soft clouds as he passed under the streetlights, their dull glow casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He walked this same path every evening, but tonight, the emptiness seemed more profound, the silence louder. Since his wife had passed away 2 years ago, this nightly walk had become his only solace, a brief escape from the suffocating quiet of his empty house. He tried not to think about the nights he used to spend with her, sitting on their porch, talking about their day, laughing at small jokes. But the memories always crept in, no matter how hard he pushed them away. He sighed, his steps slow and deliberate, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. The city had grown cold and distant, much like his own life. The once vibrant streets were now filled with unfamiliar faces, people rushing past without so much as a glance in his direction. But it wasn't just the city that had changed, it was him. He was no longer the man he once was. The man who used to laugh easily, who had a family that brought light into his days, was now just a shadow of himself. As he neared the park at the end of the street, Miguel slowed, staring at the playground in the distance. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, their chains creaking, as if mocking him with the sound of distant laughter that no longer filled his life. He turned his gaze away, not wanting to be reminded of the years he had spent there with his son, Pedro. The years before everything had gone wrong. Pedro. Even the thought of his name caused a dull ache in Miguel's chest. He hadn't spoken to his son in over a decade, ever since their argument had torn them apart. The argument itself was now a blur, just a tangled mess of words and regrets, but the consequences had been clear. Pedro had left, cutting all ties, and Miguel, too proud and too stubborn, had let him go. Now, all he had left were these lonely walks, the quiet of his home, and a heart full of unspoken apologies. Miguel shook his head, trying to clear the fog of old memories. It was too late for that now. Pedro had his own life, and Miguel had his. That's how it was meant to be, he told himself. Yet, as he crossed the street, something caught his eye, a figure standing near the corner, just at the edge of the lamplight. It was small, almost huddled, as if trying to disappear into the shadows. He squinted, his pace slowing. A child? Miguel stopped, his brows furrowing. The figure shifted, and he could make out the outline of a young girl, no older than 15 or 16, standing alone. She was wearing a thin jacket, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she shivered in the cold. Her head was down, and it seemed as if she was trying to hold back tears. He hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved in other people's business anymore. Life had taught him to keep his distance. But there was something about her that made him pause. Maybe it was the way she stood, so lost, or the way the shadows clung to her like the weight of some unseen burden. Either way, Miguel couldn't walk away. With a slow, deliberate step, he approached her. "Hey," he said softly, careful not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The girl flinched, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. She took a step back, clearly wary of him. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her voice cracked slightly. Miguel wasn't convinced. "It's late," he said, glancing around the empty street. "Where's your family? You shouldn't be out here alone." For a moment, she didn't answer, her lips pressed into a thin line as she looked down at her feet. "I don't want to go home," she whispered, barely audible. Miguel frowned. "What happened?" She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears again. "It doesn't matter. I don't know what to do." Miguel felt a familiar pang in his chest, one he hadn't felt in years. It was the same ache he had felt the night Pedro left. The helplessness of watching someone you care about walk away, knowing you couldn't stop them. He glanced at the road ahead, knowing his home was only a few blocks away. It would be easy to turn around, to walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something in him, something deep and long buried, wouldn't let him do it. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's figure this out together." The girl hesitated for a moment, her wide eyes scanning Miguel's face as if searching for any sign of danger. Her shoulders were still tense, but after a few seconds, she nodded, though it was more out of defeat than trust. She looked so fragile, Miguel thought, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her small frame. He took a step back, giving her space. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. "Luisa," she mumbled, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as the cold breeze brushed past them. "Luisa," he repeated gently, "where do you live?" "I'll walk you home." "It's not safe for you to be out here by yourself." For a moment, she said nothing, simply staring at the ground as if weighing her options. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke. "I don't want to go back," she admitted, her voice cracking again. "I had a fight with my dad, and I couldn't stay." Miguel's brow furrowed. He could feel a strange tightening in his chest, a memory tugging at the edges of his mind. The pain of estrangement, of anger left unresolved, washed over him like a wave. He knew all too well how fights between a parent and child could spiral out of control, how a single argument could become a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. "What was the fight about?" he asked cautiously, not wanting to push too hard but also needing to understand. Luisa shrugged, kicking at a loose stone on the ground. "It was stupid. He's always on my case about everything. School, my friends, even the clothes I wear. Tonight, I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I hated him, and I left." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. Miguel felt his heart clench. He could hear his own son's voice in hers, from so many years ago, angry, frustrated, accusing. He remembered Pedro standing in their kitchen, shouting about how Miguel didn't understand him, didn't respect his decisions. And then Pedro had walked out the door, leaving Miguel standing there, too proud and too hurt to call him back. Miguel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sure you didn't mean what you said," he murmured, though he knew from experience that those words would haunt her for a long time, just as they had haunted him. Luisa sniffed, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her jacket. "Maybe. But I can't go back now. He'll just be madder. And I don't want to deal with it." They stood there in silence for a few moments, the chill of the night settling in around them. Miguel glanced at his watch. It was getting late, and the streets were growing darker. He knew he couldn't leave her out here alone. Even if she didn't want to go home, she couldn't just wander the streets all night. "I get it," he said finally, his voice low. "Sometimes it feels easier to walk away than to face the mess we've made." Luisa looked up at him, her eyes softening slightly as if recognizing something familiar in his words. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts were taking. "But you can't stay out here. It's not safe. Do you have anywhere else you can go? A friend's house?" She shook her head. "No. They all live too far." Miguel exhaled deeply. The thought of letting her walk around alone didn't sit right with him, especially knowing what kind of trouble she might get into. But it wasn't like he could just take her home with him either. He had lived in solitude for so long that the idea of company, especially someone as young and fragile as Luisa, felt foreign. But he couldn't ignore her either. Not when he saw so much of Pedro in her. "I can walk you home," he said carefully. "You don't have to go inside right away, but at least let me make sure you're safe. You can sit outside for a while, clear your head, and maybe you'll feel ready to talk to your dad later." Luisa stared at him for a long moment, her lip quivering as she considered his offer. She glanced down the empty street, then back at Miguel. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Miguel offered a small smile, though it felt strange on his face, like he hadn't used those muscles in years. Good. Let's go. They began walking side by side down the quiet streets, the silence between them no longer as heavy. As they moved through the darkened neighborhood, Luisa began to relax, her shoulders no longer hunched as tightly as before. Miguel kept a few steps behind her, giving her space, but his mind was spinning with memories of Pedro. How long have you and your dad been fighting? Miguel asked after a few blocks, his curiosity getting the better of him. Luisa shrugged. A while, I guess. It feels like it's been forever. Ever since my mom left, he's been different. He's angry all the time, like everything I do just makes him mad. Miguel's heart sank at the mention of her mother. He had heard similar stories from Pedro when their family began to fracture. He wondered if Luisa's father felt as helpless and lost as he had back then, struggling to keep everything together while everything slipped through his fingers. He probably doesn't know how to handle it, Miguel said softly. Sometimes, parents don't know how to show they care the right way. Luisa didn't respond, but Miguel could see her biting her lip, her eyes focused ahead. They walked in silence for the rest of the way, the distance between them slowly shrinking as they approached her home. As they walked in silence, Miguel's mind began to drift, slipping away from the present and into memories he had tried to bury. The quiet streets around him faded, replaced by images of another time, when he was younger, when the house had been filled with life and laughter, when his relationship with Pedro had been so different. He remembered when Pedro had been Luisa's age. A stubborn, determined boy, always pushing against the boundaries Miguel tried to set. He'd been so full of life, so certain of who he wanted to be. Miguel had tried to guide him, to protect him, but his efforts had only driven a wedge between them. Pedro wanted freedom, freedom to make his own choices, freedom to make his own mistakes. But Miguel had been too afraid of the mistakes, too afraid of what could go wrong. He had tried to control everything, thinking it was his duty as a father. And then one night, much like this one, Pedro had walked out. They had argued about something Miguel couldn't even remember now, and Pedro had said things Miguel had never thought he'd hear from his son. Cruel words, full of anger and hurt. Words that still echoed in Miguel's mind, even after all these years. I hate you. I never want to see you again. Pedro had slammed the door, and the sound of it had reverberated through the house, as if signaling the end of something far greater than just that night. Miguel had stood there in the quiet, too stunned to move, too proud to follow. He had expected Pedro to come back, to cool down and apologize, as he always had. But that night had been different. Pedro hadn't come back. Miguel hadn't seen him since. As the years passed, the silence between them grew, becoming a wall that neither of them knew how to climb. Miguel had heard snippets about Pedro's life through mutual friends. He had moved to another city, found work, and eventually started a family. But Pedro never reached out, and Miguel, stubborn as ever, never found the courage to pick up the phone. Now, with every step he took alongside Luisa, Miguel couldn't help but wonder what might have been different if he had just swallowed his pride. If he had just apologized, if he had just tried harder to understand Pedro instead of trying to control him. It was a question that haunted him every day. He glanced at Luisa, who was still walking quietly beside him, her gaze fixed ahead. She reminded him so much of Pedro at that age, angry, confused, feeling misunderstood. He wondered if her father felt the same helplessness that he had once felt. The same frustration, the same fear of losing control. He couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, helping Luisa could be a way to atone for his mistakes with Pedro. Miguel sighed heavily, his breath visible in the cold night air. Do you think your dad knows you're okay? He asked after a long stretch of silence. Luisa shrugged, not meeting his gaze. I don't know. Maybe. I don't think he cares. He cares, Miguel said quietly. He just might not know how to show it. The girl glanced at him briefly, doubt written all over her face. It doesn't feel like he cares. All he does is yell at me. Nothing I do is ever good enough for him. Miguel's chest tightened. He could hear Pedro's voice echoing in hers, could feel the weight of his own mistakes bearing down on him once again. He had been that father, the one who pushed too hard, who never said the words his son needed to hear. "I'm sure that's not true," Miguel said softly. "Sometimes, parents can get lost in their own struggles. We don't always know the right way to show how much we care." Luisa didn't respond, but the tension in her face seemed to soften just a little. Miguel glanced around at their surroundings and realized they were nearing the neighborhood where Pedro had once lived. He hadn't been here in years, but everything still looked the same, the narrow streets, the modest houses, the quiet. His heart began to pound, a strange sense of déjà vu settling over him. And then it hit him. This was the neighborhood where Pedro had moved after he left. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning, and Miguel stopped in his tracks, his mind reeling. Could it be? Could Luisa? He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. "Luisa," he said slowly, carefully. "Where exactly are we going?" She looked at him, a little confused by his sudden change in demeanor. "Just a few more blocks," she said, gesturing ahead. "It's not far." Miguel nodded, though his mind was racing. He hadn't thought about where Luisa might live, hadn't considered the possibility that this quiet, angry girl could be connected to the very past he had been running from for so long. His heart pounded in his chest as they continued walking, every step bringing him closer to a reality he wasn't sure he was ready to face. They turned a corner, and Miguel's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the street immediately, the small houses lined up in neat rows, the old oak tree standing sentinel at the end of the block. It was the street where Pedro had lived. And as they approached one particular house, Miguel felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "This is it," Luisa said quietly, pointing to the house just a few feet ahead. Miguel stared at it, his throat tight. It was Pedro's house. He was sure of it. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow across the front yard. There were toys scattered across the lawn, a bike leaning against the side of the house. It was a home, full of life, full of memories. And Miguel hadn't been a part of any of it. His legs felt heavy, as if they had turned to stone. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. All he could do was stand there, staring at the house that had once belonged to his son. "Luisa," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your dad, what's his name?" Luisa looked at him, puzzled by the question. "Pedro," she said simply. "Why?" Miguel's heart stopped. His son. Luisa was Pedro's daughter. Miguel stood frozen on the sidewalk, his mind struggling to catch up with what he had just heard. Luisa was Pedro's daughter. His granddaughter. The realization crashed over him, leaving him breathless, his legs unsteady beneath him. How could he not have known? How could he have walked alongside her, talked to her, without realizing who she was? All those years, all that time spent imagining Pedro's life, wondering where he was, what he was doing, never had he considered the possibility that Pedro had a family of his own. That he had a daughter. That Miguel had a granddaughter. Luisa looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Miguel swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice, though it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "Nothing," he lied, forcing a weak smile. It's been a long time since I've been in this part of town." She nodded, accepting his explanation, though there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. "Thanks for walking me back," she said, her voice soft. "I'll be okay now." Miguel nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. His gaze was fixed on the house, the one that belonged to Pedro, his son, the one he hadn't seen or spoken to in years. And now, after all this time, he was standing just a few feet away, separated only by a front door. "I should go," Luisa said, her voice pulling him back to the present. She turned to walk up the front steps, but before she could reach the door, it opened. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as a man stepped out onto the porch, his face bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. It was Pedro. There was no mistaking it, despite the years that had passed. His hair was flecked with gray now, his face more weathered than Miguel remembered, but those eyes, those same piercing eyes, were unmistakable. The years had changed him, but not enough to erase the boy Miguel had once known. For a moment, Pedro didn't notice Miguel standing there. His attention was focused on Luisa, concern etched into his features. "Where have you been?" Pedro asked, his voice low but urgent. "I've been worried sick." "You can't just disappear like that." Luisa crossed her arms over her chest, her rebellious stance returning. "I went for a walk." "I'm fine." Pedro sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Luisa, you know you can't just run off when we have a fight. We need to talk about this." Miguel stood there, unable to move, as he watched the exchange between father and daughter. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something else, too, something that Miguel hadn't expected to see. It was love. Beneath the frustration, the anger, there was love. Pedro cared deeply for his daughter. And that realization hit Miguel like a punch to the gut. All these years, he had assumed Pedro had moved on, had forgotten about him, had built a life without any room for his old man. But seeing him now, seeing the way he spoke to Luisa, Miguel couldn't help but wonder if Pedro had felt the same pain he had felt all these years. The same longing for connection, the same unspoken apologies. Pedro's gaze finally shifted, and in that instant, his eyes landed on Miguel. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Pedro's expression froze, his mouth slightly open, as if the sight of Miguel standing there had knocked the wind out of him. His eyes widened in shock, and for the briefest second, Miguel saw something else flicker in his son's eyes, recognition, yes, but also confusion. Maybe even a touch of anger. "Miguel?" Pedro's voice was barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Miguel nodded, his throat tight. "Pedro," he said softly, his voice cracking. Luisa glanced between the two of them, her confusion deepening. "Wait," she said, her brow furrowed. "You two know each other?" Neither man spoke for a long moment. Miguel didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to explain the years of silence that had stretched between them. How could he possibly begin to explain everything that had happened, everything that hadn't been said? Pedro was the first to break the silence. "This is my father," he said, his voice flat. Luisa's eyes widened in surprise. "Your father?" "You never told me," Pedro cut her off with a wave of his hand. "There's a lot I never told you," he muttered, his gaze still locked on Miguel. "But that's not important right now." Miguel took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "It is important, Pedro," he said, his voice stronger now. "It's important to me." Pedro's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to say something, something angry, something that would widen the gap between them even further. But then, just as quickly, his expression softened, and he looked away, shaking his head. "I don't have time for this," Pedro muttered, turning his attention back to Luisa. "We'll talk later. Right now, you need to get inside. It's late." Luisa hesitated, glancing back at Miguel, her face full of questions she wasn't sure how to ask. But when she saw the tension between her father and grandfather, she nodded and quietly walked inside, the door closing softly behind her. For a long moment, neither Miguel nor Pedro spoke. They just stood there, the weight of years of silence pressing down on them both. Miguel didn't know how to begin, didn't know what to say. All the things he had imagined saying to Pedro over the years seemed to vanish from his mind. Finally, Pedro broke the silence. "Why are you here, Miguel?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Miguel didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense, anyway. But he knew one thing for sure. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know she was my granddaughter." Pedro stared at him, his expression unreadable. "That doesn't change anything." Miguel felt a sting in his chest, sharper than he had expected. He had imagined this moment for so long, reuniting with Pedro, finding the right words to apologize for the years lost between them, but now that it was happening, the reality felt cold and unforgiving. He had always thought that time would soften the edges of their anger, but here they were, standing on opposite sides of the same chasm they had created all those years ago. Pedro turned away slightly, his arms crossed over his chest as if to create more distance between them. Miguel could see the tension in his son's jaw, the way his muscles tightened as if bracing for a blow that wasn't coming. It was clear that Pedro wasn't ready for this, wasn't ready to face the past they had both tried to leave behind. Miguel swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Pedro. I didn't know about Luisa. If I had, you would have what?" Pedro snapped, cutting him off. His voice was tight with frustration, his eyes flashing with an anger that Miguel hadn't seen in years. "You would have come back? Tried to be part of her life? Is that what you're going to say?" Miguel opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell Pedro that he would have been there, that he would have done things differently. But the truth was more complicated than that. He hadn't been there for Pedro, and deep down, he knew that he had let too much time slip through his fingers to make any promises about what could have been. "I don't know," Miguel admitted, his voice quiet. "I don't know what I would have done. But I would have tried, Pedro. I would have tried." Pedro scoffed, shaking his head. "It's too late for that now." Miguel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him, the guilt and regret that had built up over time threatening to overwhelm him. "It doesn't have to be too late," he said softly, his eyes fixed on Pedro's. "We can still fix this." Pedro's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked like he was going to walk away. But then he stopped, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of their history was finally catching up with him. "Fix what, exactly?" he muttered, his voice weary. "There's nothing left to fix, Miguel. You walked away. You made your choice. I made mine." Miguel felt his chest tighten. "I didn't walk away," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You left. You walked out that door, Pedro, and he stopped himself, the words catching in his throat. He didn't want to blame Pedro, not now. Blame had kept them apart for too long. "I didn't stop you," he corrected, his voice softer. "I should have, but I didn't. And I've regretted that every day since." Pedro turned to face him fully, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and something else, something deeper, more painful. "You think I don't regret it?" he asked, his voice raw. "You think I don't regret the way things ended between us? But you were the one who made me feel like I wasn't good enough. You were the one who pushed me away." Miguel felt the sting of those words, but he didn't flinch. He deserved them. He had spent years trying to control Pedro, trying to shape him into the man he thought he should be, instead of accepting the man Pedro wanted to become. And now, all those years of trying to protect him had done nothing but drive them apart. "I was wrong," Miguel said, the words heavy on his tongue. "I didn't know how to be your father. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I see now that I was just pushing you away. I didn't know how to let you live your life." Pedro's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're right," he said bitterly. "You didn't. And now it's too late to fix that." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, the weight of their shared history pressing down on both of them. Miguel's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let the silence swallow them. "Not again." "It's not too late," Miguel said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "It's not too late to fix this. I can't undo the past, Pedro. I can't take back the things I said or the things I did. But I can be here now. I can try to make things right." Pedro looked away, his face hard, but Miguel could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time since they had started talking, Pedro didn't seem completely closed off. There was a crack in his armor, small but significant. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Pedro said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Miguel swallowed, nodding. I don't expect you to, he said softly. I don't expect anything. I just want the chance to try. To try and be part of your life again. Part of Luisa's life. Pedro's shoulders slumped, the tension finally leaving his body as he let out a long, shaky breath. He didn't speak for a long time, and Miguel waited, his heart in his throat. Finally, Pedro turned back to him, his eyes tired but not as hard as before. I need time, he said simply. Miguel nodded, his chest tight with emotion. Take all the time you need. They stood there in silence, the years of hurt and regret still hanging between them, but now there was something else, something fragile but hopeful. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The days that followed their confrontation passed in a haze for Miguel. He replayed the conversation with Pedro over and over in his mind, scrutinizing every word, every pause, every glance. Part of him still couldn't believe it had happened, that after all these years, they had finally spoken, that he had seen Pedro again. The meeting had been tense, painful, but it had also cracked open a door that Miguel had thought was sealed shut forever. He hadn't expected Pedro to forgive him. The hurt was too deep, too raw. But Pedro's words had left Miguel with something he hadn't felt in years, hope. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there, flickering in the back of his mind. Pedro had asked for time, and Miguel was willing to give him that, no matter how long it took. Days turned into weeks, and Miguel continued his routine, though something had shifted in him. He no longer walked the streets in solitude, haunted by the past. Now, he found himself thinking of the future, of the possibility that he might, one day, be part of Pedro's life again. And Luisa's. His granddaughter. The thought of her still filled him with a strange mix of wonder and sadness. She had been right there, walking beside him, and he hadn't even known. It wasn't long before the phone call came. It was a quiet afternoon when his cell phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Miguel glanced at it, expecting a telemarketer or one of the few acquaintances who still checked in on him from time to time. But when he saw the name on the screen, Pedro, his heart stopped. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for, but also the moment he feared. What would Pedro say? What if he had decided that it was too late, that they were better off staying apart? With trembling fingers, Miguel answered the call. Hello? There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. Hey, Miguel. It's Pedro. Miguel's heart clenched at the sound of his son's voice. Pedro. It's good to hear from you. Another pause. Miguel could hear the uncertainty in Pedro's voice, the weight of everything still unsaid. Yeah, I've been thinking about what you said. About trying. Miguel held his breath, waiting. I'm not ready to forgive everything, Pedro continued, his voice low. But Luisa, she's been asking about you. She wants to meet you properly. I thought maybe we could take it slow. See how things go. Miguel closed his eyes, the relief washing over him in waves. Of course, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I understand. I don't want to rush anything. I'm just grateful for the chance. Pedro didn't respond right away, but Miguel could hear the soft exhale of breath on the other end. It was enough. For now, it was enough. They made plans to meet the following weekend at Pedro's house. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward something new. Miguel spent the days leading up to the visit in a strange state of anticipation and anxiety. He had no idea what to expect. Would Pedro still keep his distance? Would Luisa be angry with him for not being part of her life sooner? When the day finally arrived, Miguel stood in front of Pedro's house, his hands trembling slightly as he rang the doorbell. The door opened almost immediately, and there stood Luisa, her expression a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Hey, she said, stepping aside to let him in. I'm glad you came. Miguel smiled, though his nerves made it feel stiff. Thank you for inviting me. Pedro appeared a moment later, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. There was a tension in the air, but it wasn't as sharp as before. It was softer now, more like the awkwardness of people who hadn't spoken in years rather than the bitterness of old wounds. They sat down in the living room, Luisa on one end of the couch, Miguel on the other. Pedro lingered near the door, watching but not intruding. Luisa broke the silence first. "So," she said, her eyes flicking to Miguel. "You're my grandfather." The bluntness of the statement caught Miguel off guard, but he nodded. "Yes, I am." "Why didn't you ever come around before?" she asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes searching. Miguel hesitated, glancing briefly at Pedro before answering. "That's a hard question to answer, Luisa. The truth is, your father and we didn't part on the best terms. And I let that keep me away for a long time. Too long." Luisa considered this, her brow furrowed slightly. "But you're here now." Miguel nodded, his throat tight. "Yes. I'm here now." There was a brief silence, then Luisa leaned forward, her eyes softening just a little. "I think that's what matters." Miguel's heart swelled, the simple words hitting him harder than any grand gesture could have. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt like it had been years in the making. "I hope so." From the corner of his eye, he saw Pedro relax just a little, the tension in his shoulders easing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The weeks that followed felt like a slow but steady awakening for Miguel. He had begun to make tentative visits to Pedro's house, each one a little less awkward than the last. Every time he walked through the door, there was a sense of fragile hope that lingered in the air, a hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. Luisa, to Miguel's surprise, was quick to warm up to him. She had a directness about her that reminded him of Pedro when he was young. She asked questions, lots of them, and Miguel did his best to answer each one honestly. She didn't shy away from the hard questions either, the ones about why he and Pedro had drifted apart, why he hadn't been around. And every time she asked, Miguel felt that old guilt rising to the surface, but he faced it. He owed her that much. "I think I would have liked my grandmother," Luisa said one afternoon, her voice soft as they sat on the porch together. "She sounds nice." Miguel smiled, the memory of his late wife warming his heart. "She was. She would have loved you." There was a long pause as Luisa traced her finger along the edge of the porch railing. "Do you think she would have been able to fix things between you and my dad?" Miguel hesitated. "Maybe," he said after a moment. "She always had a way of seeing things clearer than I did. But sometimes people need to find their way back on their own." Luisa nodded, her eyes thoughtful. She didn't push the subject further, and for that, Miguel was grateful. The road between him and Pedro was still a long one, full of unspoken words and old wounds, but there was something between them now that hadn't been there before, something that felt like progress. As for Pedro, their interactions remained cautious, but the sharp edges of their conversations had softened. There were still long stretches of silence, still moments when the weight of their past threatened to pull them under, but they were learning to navigate it, slowly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. It was the beginning of understanding. One evening, after a quiet dinner at Pedro's house, Miguel lingered a little longer than usual. He stood at the doorway, looking out at the darkening sky, feeling the cool breeze on his face. Pedro was in the kitchen, washing up the dishes, and Luisa had already gone upstairs to finish her homework. For the first time in years, Miguel felt something close to contentment settle over him. Pedro walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He stopped when he saw Miguel standing by the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt peaceful. "Thanks for coming over," Pedro said, his voice gruff but sincere. Miguel nodded, turning to face him. "Thanks for having me." There was a long pause, and then, to Miguel's surprise, Pedro took a step closer. "I know things aren't perfect between us. But I'm trying. For Luisa's sake. And for us, too, I guess." Miguel's throat tightened. He hadn't expected this, not so soon, and not from Pedro. He nodded, swallowing hard. I know, he said quietly. I'm trying to. Pedro met his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever, and in that moment, Miguel saw something that he hadn't seen since Pedro was a boy, something that looked a lot like forgiveness, or at least the beginning of it. I'll see you next weekend? Pedro asked, his voice softer now. Miguel smiled, his heart light. Yeah. I'll see you next weekend. He stepped out into the cool night air, the door closing gently behind him. As he walked down the street, his hands tucked into his pockets, Miguel felt the weight he had carried for so many years begin to lift. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was lighter now, less suffocating. There was still work to be done, still conversations to be had, but for the first time in years, Miguel believed that they could get there. He had spent so much of his life walking alone, trapped in a prison of his own making, but now he was walking toward something. Toward healing. Toward his son. Toward his granddaughter. The road ahead would be long, but Miguel was ready for it. He wasn't walking it alone anymore. And as he turned the corner toward his own home, the shadows of the past still trailing behind him, Miguel couldn't help but smile. He was finally on his way back.
Stories have the power to transform lives, and if this one moved you, imagine the next ones. Subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of inspiration and reflection. If you have experienced something similar, or if this story brought back a special memory, share it in the comments. Your experience could inspire others. And don't forget to like the video and share it with someone you know will be just as inspired as you.